Hi, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the 1T.org US Community Collaborative, the final event of this calendar year. Super excited to have a special guest joining us today to talk a little bit about a really exciting new book that recently released that would have a lot of applicability to this community. We'll give folks another minute or two to join in before I turn it over to Lauren. But in the meantime, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the exciting kind of time we're at in this midway point through the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. The 1T.org movement started at the beginning of this decade as a complement to the UN Decade, and Lauren's work and research around this book started around the same time. So I think this is a really fun and exciting opportunity for us to sort of zoom out and hear from someone who's been on the ground alongside many people in this community, researching and interviewing and thinking a lot about a lot of the things that we're thinking about. What is a forest? What does restoration look like? Right tree, right place. A lot of the things that are in the lexicon of the 1T world are things that Lauren has been thinking and exploring deeply over the past 4 or 5 years. So at this midpoint, a great opportunity for us to zoom out. So really excited to have Lauren Oakes today joining us, the author of the recently released Treekeepers, The Race for a Forested Future. Lauren's a conservation scientist and science writer. She's held various appointments at Stanford over the years as a researcher, lecturer, and adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Earth System Science. She's the author of In Search of the Canary Tree and lives in Bozeman, Montana with her lovely family. Lauren, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing some of your findings and work about this really great book that I just finished called Treekeepers. So Lauren, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to join this community. First and foremost, I want to thank you all for the work that you're doing. And like Kevin said, I interviewed about 150 people around the world who are involved in this movement one way or another. So I guarantee some of you are on this call and joining this webinar today. Thank you for the work you're doing. And for those of you who shared your perspectives with me, you really helped shape the story as well. Yeah, I'm going to kind of do a mix here today. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. So, it's about sharing some stories from my work, synthesizing some lessons, and hopefully, leaving you with some thoughts as you embark on the next 5 years of this decade. I will share some stories and do a little reading from Treekeepers, and then I think I got 3 or 4, and then I have some thoughts on some things that I've, in my research, what I think is working well, and also, the persistent myths that are maybe challenging for the movement moving forward. So hopefully that sparks some conversation for you all and thought moving forward. Just a little bit of background about how I got into writing. I'm an ecologist and land change scientist by training. Spend most of my time working on land management, forest management in light of climate change. But I've always been a storyteller. I love telling stories from science, and how many people could put this slide up and say Rachel Carson has been an inspiration to them? I'm one of them. She was really instrumental as a scientist and a storyteller with the publication of Silent Spring. And I feel like a lot of people go to college saying they'll study one thing and they totally change directions. Well, I went to college saying that I wanted to do environmental science and I wanted to tell stories, and I'm still doing that. So I have worn 2 hats over the years. I spent some time working for the Wildlife Conservation Society on their forest and climate change team. I've published in many of the journals that you all know well, but then have really loved the process of taking either my own research or other people's research, and in the case of this book, other people's research really, and sharing it in a way that I hope can make a positive impact. So my first book, In Search of the Canary Tree, came out of my own PhD research. It's a story of yellow cedar, of a species, yellow cedar in Alaska, that's dying because of climate change, and the communities that were adapting in various ways. But it's also one of hope, being a young scientist and studying an issue that seems really dark, and spending lots of time around dead and dying trees, knowing why they're dying, I have had my own struggles with the climate grief and what's my outlook. And I really found my research in those communities pretty empowering at the time and hopeful, because I could see the ways in which people were being innovative and adapting to a changing climate already. So as Kevin alluded to, I'll give you a little backstory on, how did the idea for Treekeepers come to be. When I was finishing In Search of the Canary Tree, and that came out in 2018, I started thinking about and really reading about some of the countries that were experiencing reversals in forest cover. So Bhutan, Chile, China, Vietnam, Costa Rica, these are countries that, depending on what we define a forest to be, you can say have really experienced an increase in forest cover. And that became interesting to me and compelling, and thinking about, what are the stories of hope, and could this happen at a global scale? Kind of along that same time, this idea of planting a tree really kind of became a catch-all way to do something good for the planet. This was, I think, 2019. I ordered my holiday Christmas cards, and this is in the book. But, I got this notice. Thank you again for choosing paper culture. We're excited that you've decided to dedicate the tree we will be planting. And together with wonderful customers like you, we've planted over 1 million trees. I want to note, I hope paper culture is not online today, because they keep sending me the same one. I still order my cards from them, and 5 years later, they've planted over 1 million trees. But at that time, I was both feeling like, okay, I'm doing something. This is great. I chose paper culture. And also, where did that tree go? What is it going to do? Who's planting that tree? Will it survive into the future? Around that same time, 2019, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Best and et al. Paper. For those of you, does anybody not know me in this group? Probably everybody knows what that is, but I'll share more. Tom Crowther as the senior author, and Jean-Francois Bastin came out with a global potential study. And, immediately the headlines hit with painting a portrait of both sides of this, that tree planting could have this mind-blowing potential to tackle the climate crisis. Then, the rebuttals of planting trees alone won't solve the crisis. And even at that time, I felt like there were these two camps emerging, and I wanted to take a critical look at this question: to what extent can trees really save us, and how, in a deeper and meaningful way, more than you can do in an 800-word headline or an 800-word article with a slick headline. So the book opens, and I'll read from that excerpt in just a bit, with a brief story of Tom Crowther and his work in 2015, with a study that came out, and suggesting that the Earth is home to about 3 trillion trees now, half as many as when civilizations arose. But then I really focus on the 2019 study with Jean-Francois Bastin, looking at the global potential. So how many more trees could the Earth support? And the media that came after that, I think you all are familiar with that story. But I'm going to start by reading from that section, from that opening. There was a shift, a tipping point, from nobody knowing about it to everybody knowing about it, Jean-Francois Bastin told me. Then it was uncontrollable. I'd called him from my home in Montana. It was a chilly spring morning with snow still falling in May. Jean-Francois was in Brussels, where it was evening. He was sick with a cold, but surprisingly willing to talk with me, despite the initial reluctance he'd expressed over email. I understood why he didn't want to reopen old wounds. We were discussing a study he'd led that was published in the esteemed journal Science in 2019. It was called The Global Tree Restoration Potential, and within days of its release, oil companies were announcing tree planting commitments, and industry proponents had released statements asserting that the most effective way to eliminate carbon is reforestation. The authors of the study told reporters that from their analysis, the Earth could sustain another 1.2 trillion trees. The news headlines focused on planting trees. How to erase 100 years of carbon emissions? Plant trees, lots of them. Rolling Stone later reported that the sensational study was picked up by over 700 media outlets, an atypical situation, even for research published in the best journals. It all sounded like the much anticipated and much needed discovery of the silver bullet. I watched from the sidelines as two camps sprang up almost immediately, those saying let's plant and those saying it won't work, in reference to this big idea that trees could solve the climate crisis. The camps divided further as planting interest peaked. Governments ramped up commitments and support. The outdoor clothing brand Timberland launched a campaign to support its tree planting project, Plant the Change. Energy and petroleum companies like Total dedicated funding for forests. Meanwhile, scientists attacked the global potential analysis in journal articles, as well as the authors themselves on social media platforms. Jean-Francois was unfairly made to look like a patsy for big oil, which is so far from the truth. Some people thought that attempting to discredit him and the science might be the way to correct misperceptions that tree planting could alleviate the need to reduce fossil fuels. One response in science called the study's estimate of how much carbon these additional trees could sequester anomalous and detailed incorrect assumptions and calculations. Other ecologists expressed reasonable concerns about how and where the planting would occur. Tom Crowther, the study's senior author, later admitted that he got the communications wrong. He had coordinated the media launch with his research lab's in-house communications team. It's so naive now, he told me, but I truly didn't think tree restoration would mean tree planting to the media and the public. Tom had made a splash a few years prior with another study that assessed how many trees there are in the world. It estimated 3.04 trillion, about half as many as when human civilization arose. I remember feeling conflicted at the time the global potential study came out and those camps emerged. I thought that perhaps the widening support for more trees could help foster a world that better supports the life within it. The ability of trees to sequester carbon would be only part of that story. I knew there wasn't one quick fix to climate change, and I was frustrated by those promoting the contrary. I also felt uplifted by the booming interest in tree planting. I still feel that way. Tom told me that the misconstrued messaging was, quote, a terrible mistake, but that it also started so much. It engaged more people. A movement grew. In December of that year, I ordered holiday cards with a few photos on my little family and received a notice that my purchase had enabled the planting of one tree. A tree to grow strong with you, I offered in dedication to my infant son. I wondered who would plant that tree, what tree, where and when. Would it survive? Would it deliver whatever the person wanting it or funding it was expecting? I doubt the company's notice was intended to trigger such internal turmoil. But I also knew sustaining a forest or growing a tree is far more complex than planting one. I wanted to get to the bottom of the debate, to unpack the ways in which growing forests could benefit life into the future and help curtail the climate crisis. I would eventually seek out the people who are attempting to recreate what was lost through our many shared experiences of forest degradation around the world. They are our tree keepers. I would also decipher what restoration has meant in the past in relation to what is still possible today in our warming world. As a forest ecologist, I had to start with the earliest efforts to map the surface of the earth with satellites and modern technology. If you cannot map it, you cannot really develop any strategy to conserve it or to monitor it, Jean-Francois had told me. A systematic way of viewing forests around the world enabled more people to track changes. It also helped trigger the dream for more. So Treekeepers became a quest to understand the science behind, legitimacy of, and the hard work involved in this global movement to restore forest cover, however one defines forest. I interviewed, like I said, 150 people around the world, and there's kind of three sections to the book. I take a deep look at the state of the world's forests and their potential. And in this first section, I also look at countries that have experienced reversals in forest cover in the past, and some historical examples of what has led to them, kind of setting up, how is this movement different and what are we seeing today in contrast. The second part of the book is about innovative efforts in reforestation and restoration. And the last part is about scale, which I'm sure everyone here spends a lot of time thinking about. How do we scale this work across the planet while also, ensuring that you're implementing a project that's sustainable and really dependent on the local conditions and local context. I'm going to share another story from the first part of the book. As someone who's spent a lot of time in graduate school with remotely sensed imagery, I actually never went back to the history. I kind of just started using Landsat images, knowing when they were first available, but not knowing the history or really how it worked. And so I was really thrilled to come across Virginia Norwood, who is kind of like a hidden figure. Those of you who've seen that movie. It was only in recent years, probably, 3 or 4 years ago now, that she was recognized by NASA as the mother of Landsat. And she helped develop the sensor that was in Landsat 1 and enabled really the first global monitoring that was with publicly available data. So I had a chance to go visit her. I interviewed 150 people. I didn't travel to see all those people. I did a lot of interviews over Zoom, coming out of the pandemic and in the pandemic. It was a time when people were really willing to meet that way. And I only really traveled somewhere when I knew they were going to be in the book, or this project was going to be in the book, or I needed to learn more on the ground and get a lot of opportunities to have good description. So I went to visit her in Topanga Canyon, and I'll read from that section as well. An old photograph of Half Dome in Yosemite National Park hangs on a wall of a wood-paneled bedroom in Topanga Canyon in the Santa Monica Mountains. I went to see it and to meet its owner, Virginia Norwood, on a hot, dry summer's day. The photograph is long and narrow, a panorama of the iconic vista. Its thick wood frame blends into the walls of the room, which has a sweet and musty smell, the kind that makes me think of my grandmother. But there's something strange about the photograph. The colors aren't right. The dome appears ghostly with its striking face contrasted in dark gray, almost black. The peaks in the distance and the ground exposed beneath the trees are nearly white too. The sky is in shades of gray, not blue. The trees are dense in some places and sparse in others, and they appear like normal trees, except that they are red, as if part of a forest in crimson, rust, and cranberry. It isn't a photograph taken by your typical camera. It was created instead from data collected line by sensors on a multispectral scanner system, the MSS, that would soon orbit Earth for the first time ever. A dashed box outlines the word Hughes in the far right corner beneath the image for the Hughes Aircraft Company. The light reflected by the landscape was captured 2.5 miles away from the ground during a trial run before the MSS went to space. In reality, those red forests were just as real as any green ones. We're just used to seeing trees as green with our own two eyes. The sensor captures light of different wavelengths as separate bits of data, and then scientists assign them colors. The MSS can register more light, such as infrared, than is visible to humans. Upper management wanted pictures, Virginia said, seeming a bit disgruntled at the memory of the pre-launch testing requirements. She and her colleagues had run a lot of lab tests while refining the prototype. Since the tests were Californians, they had to go to Yosemite, she chuckled. You can probably see she didn't think the additional testing was necessary, her daughter, Naomi, chimed in. Nevertheless, Virginia outfitted the crew with the engineering model of the scanner, which was mounted to a turntable in the back of a truck, and sent them to acquire pretty images. They would show what the invention could do before the 105-pound flight model was launched into space that same year, 1972. Virginia was 95 years old when I visited her. Every morning, she climbed a rickety stepladder to pour seed into bird feeders for the Oregon juncos, housefinches, and spotted towhees that darted beneath the branches of the giant coastal oaks that shaded her home. Naomi, her family, and those who know her well call her Ginger. Only recently had she become more widely known as the mother of Landsat, the first satellite launched with the express intent to study and monitor the surface of the Earth. Virginia's high school guidance teacher, when seeing her aptitude test results, had suggested she become a librarian. She applied to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology instead, and when Virginia began her studies there in 1944, she was only about one of a dozen women in her class. She finished just 3 years later, and it didn't take long for her inventions to go to the moon. By 1966, when Surveyor 1, a robotic spacecraft, landed on the moon in the first fully controlled soft lunar landing, it transmitted images back to Earth on Virginia's transmitter. She gave us the ability to see the moon up close and then soon thereafter to rediscover and monitor our own planet. Orbiting the Earth, the satellite could scan the entire planet every 18 days. It was called the Earth Resources Technology Satellite, ERTS, before being renamed more aptly Landsat. Among many other things, it began producing our first global view of the world's forest from space. So I start with Virginia because I think of her as the first of the modern day tree keepers, given what Landsat went on to do, and many other scientists connected to it or used it for forest monitoring. But also because beginning with that effort to assess the state of the world's forests and looking at the many studies that have done that, brings into question what is a forest. I have my own experiences and my own idea of what that is, and what a forest is. There are, over 800 definitions in the academic literature of what a forest is. And, when you try to put together a synthesis, a study of any kind, taking one variable across the planet, you need to define it one way. But does that definition capture everything that a forest is? I think they fall short in different ways that I write about, and that you probably know about. But I'm going to read from that section as well. What is a forest? Based on a little bit of my experience. And it also kind of sets up in this movement, what are we trying to restore? What are we creating if we're planting or letting a forest regenerate? And can what we create ever fully, replace what was there before? Tree canopy or forest cover seen from a satellite only reveals so much. What those forests are under the canopy and inside the green has changed over time. But what is a forest anyway? That definition matters in distinguishing what people can protect from what they can create. It matters for understanding what our planet is gaining and what it is losing, what the collective dreams for future life on Earth could be. The first great forested landscape that I experienced outside the United States is now among the last intact tropical ones remaining. I was 17. Volunteering for a program under the Albert Schweitzer Institute during my senior spring of high school, I collected medical supplies from hospitals to send to communities that needed them. I had been reading about Schweitzer's reverence for life, his ethical view that all life is valuable and important. No life, be it human, animal, or plant, should be sacrificed without determining that a greater good could come from such loss or harm. I was inspired by his service to others as a doctor, humanitarian, and philosopher. Our medical supplies, along with the clothes we collected, went to Suriname, and I accompanied the last shipment with a small group of student volunteers and teachers. We spent most of our time in the capital, Paramaribo, delivering boxes to schools and orphanages. If I close my eyes and think back to that trip today, more than 20 years later, most of my memories of Suriname have faded. I vaguely recall walking among the colonial houses along the banks of the Suriname River and helping to paint a concrete wall outside a school with a vibrant mural of what I no longer know. I remember sweating in the classrooms we visited and my arms sticking to the small wooden desks. I remember listening intently to the beautiful Dutch language of the Surinamese people. But the forests and my brief time in them, I recall in fine detail, as if their greatness was felt instinctually, their life imprinted upon me, as if my young mind already knew that our lives were intertwined. Today, Suriname is the most forested country in the world, with primary forests covering 90% of its vast lands. It falls into the unique category of high forest, low deforestation, or HFLD countries, which have greater than 50% tree cover and a deforestation rate of less than 0.22% per year. There's a long footnote on that because everyone says 0.22%, like, is that really a lot? But then when you start adding it up year to year, it is. Anyhow, the HFLD countries, including Gabon, Guyana, Peru, Bhutan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Belize, Colombia, and a handful of others, contain about a quarter of the world's remaining primary forests, those that have reached notable age and remain relatively undisturbed by human activity. These HFLD countries retain some of our big blocks, our greatest hopes. They are the relatively large, intact tropical and subtropical forests. Those blocks are in the Amazon and Congo basins in Papua New Guinea and at the center of Borneo. One afternoon, we drove out of the city where almost half of the country's population resides and made our way inland from the coast. It was as if we penetrated a wall of green and entered primeval forests with canopies towering above, vines and foliage sweeping down low. I cannot recall if I learned any species names back then, but I remember seeing and touching more than I could have counted if I even tried. Tall palms extending stories above, flowering trees with ovate leaves and small white flowers trailing down to the ground in clusters like waterfalls. I remember the leaves dangling around me and the crunching sound beneath my feet, the striking variation in shapes and sizes, textures, and smells of a life so diverse. That forest expanded my view of what a forest is and what a forest could be. In the years that have passed since those few days in one of the most diverse and intact forests on our planet, I've visited only a couple others that rival its vitality. In the Brazilian Amazon and in Borneo, Indonesia, I was similarly drawn to the leaf litter and dark soils and the distinct feeling of existing within layers of life. The branches, foliage, and vines engulfed me in ways I had never experienced as someone who grew up in the eastern United States. My earliest impressions of what a forest is were shaped by oaks and maples, big trees and small patches or standing alone in backyards and small farms. Eastern white oak and chestnut oak, Acer species saccharum, the sugar maple in particular. In Chile, I encountered my first monoculture forest plantation. That was years later. I remember feeling such an unexpected sense of confusion. Trees surrounded me, so technically I was in a forest, but all these trees appeared alike, neatly cultivated in rows and evenly spaced. They were just one species of eucalyptus, consistent in height and age. It felt unnatural and manipulated, like a forest imposed upon the earth rather than one coming from it. It was not the natural and primeval forest that once was, but instead one fostered by people's need, by demand for pulp and paper and a fast-growing product. Should we really call this a forest too, I'd wondered? I spent some time visiting a number of different kinds of forests, and Treekeepers draws from places that I've been to in the past through other work, or ones that I researched, from afar, or some that I made special trips to visit. And I'll just highlight a few here because I think they spark in me, or they highlight, that question of what a forest is and how do we define it moving forward and what are we trying to create. I spent a lot of time researching a Paulownia plantation in Suffolk, England. So this is a genus of hardwood species that is native to China, and it's a hybrid now that's planted for its real prowess in carbon. Some estimates show growing an acre of Paulownia as equivalent to taking about 80 cars off the road each year. This is a really wild-looking tree that is incredibly fast-growing, and it's kind of like the Jack and the Beanstalk. And in some interesting arguments, I remember a few people I interviewed in England saying, well, this land, had been used prior to plant potatoes. It had been a farm, and the company was leasing it from owners. The productivity on the land had gone down. The potatoes and other plants that were had been traditionally farmed there were no longer as productive. And the argument there was, potatoes weren't native here before. What's wrong with planting these if it has a new purpose? Here's an example of farming for carbon in that way. There's obviously lots of things we could talk about with that, concerns and risks and potential trade-offs. And it also raises the question, if you're looking at just one species, a plantation of one species, what are you losing and what are you gaining? But this too is, a forest. I loved spending time researching and getting to interview a lot of people involved in urban forestry. American Forests has been doing some really incredible work on tree equity. And I spent, I was actually interviewing people all over the country, US particularly. I was focused on the United States particularly, and everybody was gone during this one period of time. Nobody could meet. And I was like, where's everybody going? They were going to a urban forestry conference in Seattle. So I went too, and had a chance to visit some communities in Tacoma, that is among the least treed cities of the Evergreen State. And something that really moved me, and that comes across in the story in the urban setting, is how many benefits trees provide people. In the urban setting, you see people coming in contact with trees on a daily basis in sheer numbers that you don't see in the ones we kind of all visualize as these remote forests, are the ones that I've spent more time in. But the urban forest is another really important one. And there's a lot of great work, as you know, going on to increase forest cover in these in communities for a lot of good reasons. Spent some time also in Loch Katrine. This is in Scotland, and this was one of the earliest carbon certified projects in Scotland. Part of what was fascinating, and I do kind of go deeply into the controversy surrounding carbon credits. We could spend a little time talking about that in discussion today too. But what I really liked digging on in the UK system is, we ended up with these voluntary markets, which in the initial vision of what forest carbon credits could be, that wasn't really the idea, in a system where we had ended up with a global cap and trade system. It would have been really different what played out for forest carbon credits and carbon credits in general. But the UK, has regulations in place, and this is an example of a project that's going towards, reductions that happen within country, as opposed to offsetting, outside the country. So there was just some interesting things to learn from these projects, and I chose this one in particular because it is an area that has a water source that directs to most of Scotland, and so is the main supply of fresh water to people living there. And the land had been previously used for sheep herding and raising sheep, and it led to some problems with disease and bacteria getting into the water. So this project to well, they call it a forest because there hasn't been a forest there in less than 50 years. It was much longer ago. But to create a forest here again was to, not only have carbon benefits and create carbon credits, but also protect this water source, and restore some native species to the region. So I tell a story from, and maybe some of you have seen this. This was a fresco painting from the 1930s that caught a lot of media, went kind of viral, and it was, a commentary outside of tree restoration world on just what is restoration. So the painting is there on the left, and the restored version of it is on the right. And this even hit the New York Times. But it brings up the question of what are we trying to restore and to what? And also, for the general reader, everybody here is really knowledgeable about this, highlights, eventually in the narrative, the importance of protecting the existing forests, and working towards restoring, holistically, what we call 5-star restoration, or really far on an ecological continuum on a restoration continuum of ecological integrity, thinking about like, how can we bring back a diversity of species? So I use this as a story to kind of illustrate what are some intense ecological concepts, but to show that what we create, even in the best of efforts, can't fully replace, what was there, at least on a short time scale. I think I'll share one last reading, and then we'll go into questions. I want to be sensitive to time and make sure, because we're at 1:33, we're good. I spent the book. I'll rewind then, because I was feeling pressured on time, but I'm seeing it's only 1:30, so that's good. I'll pause for a second here. The narrative kind of takes the reader through, what people in the field talk about as a reforestation pipeline. So thinking all the way from seed collection to long-term stewardship of the trees that are standing and the trees that we're growing. And one of the other fascinating topics I really enjoyed researching was on, this movement to increase our wild seed collection and cultivation efforts. And it took me both to Hawaii, where I'll talk to you about someone I met there, and I'll share a story. But I also visited the Millennium Seed Bank in England while I was there, and learned a fair bit about Nikolai Vavilov. I don't know if he's someone that's familiar to others. He was new to me, but he essentially started the Global Seed Bank in Leningrad, which was in the 1920s, not that long ago. And I was kind of looking at, where are our world's best efforts or biggest efforts to store seed? And, it turns out that motivation has largely been for food security, and that's what it came from. And, it was only 100 years ago, not even 100 years ago, that we had this first global seed bank. He collected crop seeds across 5 continents in more than 60 countries over 20 years. He and his colleagues built what was, the largest collection of seeds from cultivated plants in the world. And his story has this, wild, tragic ending, because he was imprisoned as those involved in genetics became part of Stalinist purges, and he actually died of starvation, which is a wild turn of events from, the impact that he had and has had on our efforts, our global efforts in food security. And he really put this idea as the key motivation for seed collection efforts, was that agricultural biodiversity is the cornerstone for building greater food security around the planet. And I would say the same for our forests, that in this period of time when, we're in the UN decade of restoration, we are dealing on a daily basis with, heightening effects of climate change. Where our seed comes from and what we're collecting and what we're keeping into the future will have a large influence on what there is. It's really fascinating to learn that about 100 species or so are planted, most commonly around the world, when in reality, we have about over 77,000 tree species. So, scaling those efforts and thinking of ways that are innovative in locally led projects to work with wild seed is really important. So I spent some time in Hawaii, both with Jill Wagner, who's a consultant who specializes in seed banking, and also researching terraformation. There's a part in the book where I try to show that there's been a real, turn of interest in the kinds of, and the diversity of people involved in the restoration movement. And whereas I typically think of those people coming from like a conservation background or environmental science background, now we're seeing, as many companies and tech firms and startups invest in this movement, and terraformation was one of those ones that caught my attention. So it was really, helpful to talk to a lot of people who'd been from startup world and wanted to make a difference in this movement. All right, so and Jill Wagner used to work for terraformation. I'm gonna read from this section. Here she is standing outside a shipping container, which is a remote seed bank, which I'll tell you about. The heavy steel doors creaked as Jill Wagner, a consultant who specializes in seed banking, opened the end of the shipping container. I stepped from one world into the other. Outside, the pink plumeria flowers often used to make Hawaiian leis were blooming. It was hot and sunny, and there were nursery tables with trays of green grasses and other plants. The interior of the retrofitted container felt cool and refreshing, and it looked like a laboratory in meticulous order. There were seed samples everywhere. Labels detailed the species, date, and the lot number or owner of each collection. Seed is always the property of the landowner, she told me. I'm like a safety deposit box. I provide the space to bank and store the seeds properly. We were standing inside the operating prototype of an off-grid seed bank, which, in the original vision, could be shipped to the most remote reaches of the planet to facilitate proper seed collection, drying, and storage. Replicates had made it to sites in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania to build capacity for restoration with native species. Yet the cost of retrofitting containers and shipping them internationally was proving too high to create a global network of these local hubs. I marveled at the curious seeds of the kamani tree, a species native to Hawaii that tolerates ocean spray and salty soils. The dimpled, spherical seeds resembled brown golf balls in an aluminum cake pan. Jill had baking sheets full of oahu seed, light tan and long grain like basmati rice. I scanned the names of other seeds: koa, the largest native tree species of the Hawaiian Islands, mamaki, a nettle, ohelo, a native berry, and moringa. She carefully cleaned them with various tools, and they were now drying, a critical step to keeping seed viable for future use. When they are then stored at cold temperatures, many seeds can be banked for years, decades, even centuries. We have an unprecedented event in human history, and that's the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, Jill said with a sense of pride and hope. We have never undertaken restoring globally the earth. She was concerned about a lot of tree planting efforts that involved using only a handful of species and others focused on planting fast-growing species. Those approaches had set things off to a rocky start. Is that creating resilient habitats and systems for the next generation in the future? No, it isn't. One of the studies that she was involved in they did surveys and collected data in lots of different ways, and came up with, a number of about 400 seed banks collecting and storing wild seed around the world. Who knows whether, how representative that is. I saw a number of local efforts in really creative ways. She described that study as including even, like a refrigerator in somebody's office or in somebody's home. But I spent some time in Panama towards the end of the book. There's a project there. I was looking for a project that brought together landowners, to restore a large landscape, but through many efforts and many people coming together and deciding they wanted to change their land use. A project that was also supporting biodiversity. This is a really interesting corridor with great plant diversity and also some amazing wildlife, including a number of different species of monkeys we got to see. But here's an example of a backyard nursery, and they called it La Madre. They had a mother nursery in the community where they would bring together all the seedlings that other people were growing. And I love the system because, women, and particularly women and mothers, I've visited a number of families that were growing seeds in their own backyard, and they could sell them back to La Madre, the mother nursery, to then go into the project. And I loved, well, it created a great opportunity and a new opportunity financially for those women and families in particular. But it was also an interesting approach at scale, like not leaving anyone responsible really for running this one nursery, but everyone in the community or many people in the community coming together. And as we spent time traveling in the region, it was just neat to see, we'd stop in one place and ask a couple questions, and then someone would say, oh, we have more seedlings over here. You could really see how far the reach had been from these side nurseries. And this was, I wondered when I saw this, well, is this in Jill Wagner's study? But here we are with, someone's backyard or someone's own little seed bank. This was just in a closet where families had been collecting, and they'd go out with kids and collect seed and then arrange them by species. And I thought this was quite a contrast to the high end, seed bank, retrofitted seed bank container, and also hopeful to show that there's lots of different ways you can do this work. So I'll end with a couple highlights on what's working, what's not working. I'll also just highlight, I think in the ecological community, people talk about the word renovation as like being, the new thing, that we're not necessarily restoring something completely, but renovating and remodeling and improving on something. And when I think there's a lot of critics out there in this work for different reasons. And, I think one of the hopeful messages I took from researching this book and talking to so many people and visiting so many projects was that I think a lot of projects are delivering on multiple benefits, and a lot can come from this work, and they do take the effort to be tailored to the local context. And yes, first and foremost, we need to protect our existing forests and grow them out, but there's also a lot of space to create new forests and different land uses, and with landowners coming together. And I see a lot of hope in the movement. So what's working, that we have a global movement supported by a lot of local efforts. Talk a lot about the idea of boutique, that some people say like a boutique is not scalable, but, can we put certain guidelines or guardrails or general values on this movement and execute it at a local scale? The diversity of people and players involved, I've touched upon it a little bit today, but from, a young child collecting seed from a mother tree in Panama to an executive from a startup investing. It's awesome to see the diversity and the wide range of players. That there's a great potential to integrate trees with other land uses, both in our urban settings and agricultural areas as well. Broader understanding that this work is not just planting. I think in the backlash of the 2019 media flurry, like there was a lot of, oh, this is just planting. And I do think, now 5 years later, there's a different perception to that. And that's, a tribute to some of the good work you all have been doing too, to show that it's, first of all, if you're going to plant, it's not just planting, it's the long-term stewardship, but also, protecting our existing forests, growing out our existing forests is a huge part of this too. And lastly, I was really inspired by support for more high quality projects. I won't go into it here, but I do talk and write a fair bit about carbon markets and the price of carbon. And it's great to see that companies, and some companies in particular, are standing up to invest or pay more for a project that's going to deliver, high quality. When I say high quality, it's like a diversity of species. It's people, local people really heavily involved, and a diversity of local people heavily involved, and real clear benefits to those livelihoods and biodiversity benefits on top of the carbon benefits. This was just a cartoon. I'm going to show this today because I feel like many people here might also be stunned. This is from the New Yorker. I came upon it's from 1989. And it says at the bottom, it's great. You just tell him how much pollution your company is responsible for, and he tells you how many trees you have to plant to atone for it. And this came out of my research when I was digging back to look at what were the first offsets. And there's a whole chapter on this topic that was really fascinating to research and learn. But, I was startled of whoa, 1989, I was basically 8 years old. People were still, not only had, this is only a little bit of probably a couple of years after James Hansen had testified in front of the US Senate that climate change was a problem. All of a sudden, we're talking about offsetting and we're doing offsetting, and there's these kind of jokes, filtering around that are still filtering around today. So some of the persistent myths to leave you with: there's not enough land. The work of growing more forests is just for carbon. The increased fires mean we can't count on trees. Carbon credits are the only way, and they don't work anyhow. And forests will take too much time. I definitely touch upon these in the narrative, and I'm happy to chat about them today, but these are the ones that stand out to me as some myths that we probably still need to break down moving forward. All right, we'll open up for a little conversation here. Thank you. Yeah, I also included here, if you want to order a copy, in supporting my local bookstore, and you can order online from them, and you can get a signed, personalized copy, giving them a lot of local love. And the publisher Hachette has a sale right now, so if you want to pick up a copy on sale. And also, please reach out to me I just support the work that everyone here is doing. I'm interested in the work you're doing. If there's any way I can be of help to you and your organization, feel free to reach out.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lauren. And we put the link to Country Bookshelf and Bozeman in the chat too, so folks can get directly and support your local booksellers. They'll love that. Yeah, such a fun read for me, and such a fun way to sort of zoom out and think a lot about the work that a lot of us are doing day to day, and have that perspective. So while folks are thinking of things in the chat, I just wanted to kind of kick off the conversation with one of the themes that you brought up, and you kind of channeled Robin Wall Kimmerer and others by talking about naming something to value something. And then the concept of shifting ecological baselines. This throughput, whether it's your son or the kids in Panama who are identifying tree species and games, but talk a little bit about that, that naming something to value something, and then that notion of shifting ecological baselines.
Yeah, great question. There's a thread in the book I was going to read from it today, because I'm sure also there's probably many parents in the group who are struggling with, how do you talk to your kid about climate change, or do you talk to your kid about climate change, and how do you, I guess I'm trying to raise a child that has a sense of wonder, but is also one who wants to help make the world better. And so there is a thread, about seeing nature through my son's eyes. And the story you mentioned was, I think we were in Glacier Bay, Alaska, Glacier in Montana. And we were just on a hike, and he was probably 2 years old, riding in the backpack. And our whole hike, he was just naming trees, and not names like species, but actual names like Federico or Bob, or so we had this just a lovely walk of naming all these trees. And it made me think of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who says, in our that language is so important, and in our language, we use it for nature. We don't humanize it. We don't put life to it. We call it it. And there was my son, in the most, I don't know, just, magical way, really, just naming them all like we should, we're walking through a crowd of people. And so, there's the commentary on when will he lose that, or when would he lose that? But also, if we start to treat nature as essential to life and to our life and other life, that's a different kind of relationship. That's less about like resourcing from it or taking from it, but taking care of it. I also kind of use my relationship with my son as a tool, narrative tool, to illustrate the idea of ecological baselines, which I think to someone who's not an ecologist is really kind of a little bit hard to grasp, and it's the idea that, this first data set or this first glimpse you have, like, here is a forest, this is our starting point. Okay, are we going to restore back to that? And what was that, starting point? And it's also that over time, the baseline changes, so he is born into this world where we have fires and, every summer that come into Montana, and I take him into a secondary forest and I think about what was there before. And he thinks about, this is amazing. What are these trees? So I really like, using that cross-generational perspective to think about both what we're losing and also what we want to recreate or create or sustain moving forward.
Yeah.
And I guess it's also a point, to me, my guess is, those that are parents in this group and also struggling with, wanting to make a difference, have those same moments where you're like in awe about something and there's a deeper problem going on. And I love the ways in which he has, and having children has, taught me to hold on to that wonder in nature, and that it doesn't have to be a wild, fully, whatever word you want to use, primeval, old growth, like relatively pristine, intact HFLD country, to inspire some wonder and also have the emotional, cultural, spiritual, mental health benefits that nature provides.
Yeah, picking up on that thread, and I think thinking about the importance of urban forestry and urban forests and tree canopy covered cities where most Americans live, work, play, etc. You talk a little bit about that in your book, and you brought this up also a little bit earlier. Somebody, Angela from North Carolina, asked about sort of the development pressures and how we, again, like how we value those urban trees. They're both that sort of gateway drug to greater and exposure to forest, but also providing these critical ecosystem benefits in cities. Can you talk about, through your research, how you think about that tension between, again, like exposure and valuing, and how we, can continue to make the case for trees in cities?
Yeah. I mean, it's like the list of the benefits in cities just becomes so clear when you talk about like data showing, schools that are surrounded by better tree cover or good tree cover, like, tend to have higher test scores. Like, there's evidence of, healing rates faster in hospitals, when you have a view of nature. There's like real hard data done, comparative studies, like, showing the cooling effects, like in Portland, for example. Like, I saw a study and heard research about, a well-treed canopy being 20 degrees cooler than a lower tree cover city. The words here are awkward, sorry. Fill me in, give me a better one. And then those obviously have trickle down effects on, health for elderly in that area, or the costs of air conditioning or running a fan. So I felt like when I spent time, talking to those involved in urban forestry, it felt like so much bigger than carbon. And it helps highlight the real truth that a tree is going to deliver on carbon to some extent, to different degrees and over different timelines. And then, like, look at all these other benefits that are attached to it. I also think, some of the compelling things are just like images that are stuck in my mind right now. I visited this one spot in Tacoma where these volunteers had come out to depave an area. It's like in the city, people will pave an area and say, well, this will be a development in the future. And now, there's a pretty cool movement in some cities to take those, to depave it, take it out and say, look, well, let's, if it's going to be coming later, okay, and let's deal with that then. But in the meantime, or hopefully for longer, let's redirect it to be a green space and create a green space. And it was really powerful to stand in a place where community volunteers had come out and literally dug up pavement to put in trees. And that to me was the example of like, wow, when you want it, you're going to fight for it.
Exactly. Well, and those are appreciating assets rather than depreciating assets. When you think about valuing and balance sheets, like trees are one of the pieces of infrastructure that actually become more valuable over time, right?
Totally. The other thing that stood out to me from comments someone I interviewed in the urban setting was like, okay, well, there's a challenge of a lot of times a city will get a funding or have funding to plant. And then you talk about where does the long-term stewardship come from, and off it's an adjacent landowner. And some cities do have money for management, but not all, by far. Anyhow, the idea of like, what if trees were like street lamps? There's a funding, there's a city and a national, funding mechanism for that type of infrastructure. And when you think of it that way, then you're concerned about like, okay, well, this light has to keep working. We have to protect this light, like we have to maintain it if something happens to it. And what if trees were street lamps in that way, in our urban centers? I love that. Like it's a big game changer of how the system supports it then.
Shifting from the urban context to the large landscape context, Anna works in reforestation, particularly in sort of the post-fire landscape. And you wrote about this, and would love for you to talk more about assisted migration and climate-informed reforestation, and how you think about and your research led you to sort of what conclusions around assisted migration for future climate.
So I spent some time in British Columbia researching this topic. I went to British Columbia in particular because there's a long history of, provenance trials, a lot of data in that area, looking at like what species do better under certain conditions. And there's, a real interesting movement of climate adapted seed transfer, where it's become like standard protocol to move the seed upward, or to move populations upward. I say that loosely, but it's like in the direction of where the warming will occur, to plant populations that are more likely to survive into the future. And I think that's a kind of an extreme example because they have such a long history of data. It's set up largely for forestry species. But it illuminates, the great hope that people could implement, with local knowledge too. If you think about what species are more likely to survive, and the local knowledge that can inform that. Or, I saw plenty of other examples, number in Europe, and even cross country, where people were starting to trade seed and move populations across boundaries. So I guess I would say that I think there's a lot of good work to be done in this area, that it's like a central theme. I would put, if you ask for the guardrails or the guidances, that we have or could have to help guide local projects, is thinking about like what species are more likely to survive into the future, and what information do you have right now to help inform that? Not necessarily like what studies can we do, to have that answer 10 years from now, because people need it now.
Here. Love it. Well, we are running close on time here, and wanted to ask just more of a logistics question. So I see you're going to be at Powell's in Portland in the end of January. Are you doing any other city stops where people that are around the country may be able to see you and meet you in person?
Let's see. So Powell's in January, also Elliott Bay in January in Seattle.
Okay.
I just agreed to talk at a urban forestry conference in February. That's the Sustainable Urban Forest Coalition. So for those of you who might be attending that, I will be there in Virginia.
Right.
And yeah, they're kind of trickling in. There's a lot of radio and podcasts. It's like I'm doing a lot of that. But I love going to speak with organizations and communities. And so, yeah, it's kind of a mix of done some fundraiser events, and then, events with other practitioners. But there is if you go to my website, www.leokes.com, there's an events page, and I put anything up there that's public for an event.
We'll share that with folks after the fact, but just on behalf of the all the tree keepers out there and the one team, thank you so much for the time, and for the really, I think, shining a light on so much of the work that so many people in this community are doing day in and day out. And I couldn't recommend the book more. It's fun to hear and see and feel your experiences from around the world. So kudos on a fabulous read, and thank you for making the time to be with us. And to all the folks out there, thank you so much for joining us. Happy holidays, and we'll look
You.
forward to helping
Keep up your
build more of those
tree
guardrails for practitioners
Guides and guardrails.
next year. So
All right. Take
thanks
care.
again, Lauren. Be well, and happy holidays, everyone.
You too. Bye.